So as you know, we're carrying on this morning with our series in Philippians. We started last week, and last week I gave a brief introduction. And if you weren't around last week, I would encourage you to do a number of things. First of all, read Philippians. It's only, well, not even 4 pages long, so it shouldn't take too long. Watch last week's talk, which you'll find on YouTube or on our website. And also on our website, on the resources, helpful links section, you will find 3 Bible Project videos that will help us as we read and explore this book together. And as we come to see what this ancient letter that was written to a bunch of people that aren't us, in a very different context to us, and yet it still has lots and lots to say to us. And so those videos will help us to see some of those links. As Sharon has just reminded us, Paul was writing the book of, or the letter of Philippians from prison. And he was writing to Christians who were being persecuted for their faith. And I thought I'd start this week with a question like last week, but I thought, unlike last week, I'd like some feedback from this week. But I'd like your feedback to be more honest than it might be if you had to shout something out in front of everyone else. And so, we have a Slido. So, if you have your phones with you, and you're able, and if you're watching online and you're watching live, you can join in at this point as well. So you go to slido.com and it will ask you for a code, and if you put in that number 2252881, you don't need to put your name in, so anything you say will be anonymous. And there will be this question there, hopefully. If not, let me know, and I'll see what's going wrong. But you should have a question there. Why are some Christians reluctant to share their faith? And you can just type an answer. You can either personalize it. Let me just check. Some people are looking confused. Let me just make sure it is working. Is it working? Yeah, okay. So you can either personalize the question, why am I sometimes reluctant to share my faith? Or you can just think generally, why are other Christians reluctant to share their faith? And just put in some of, or just type away some of the reasons that for your answers to this particular question. Right, so we have got, you can carry on typing, but we've got, so afraid, let me start at the bottom because they're going to keep moving otherwise. So fear of rejection. Maybe we find it's too complicated, and we don't know how to explain. We don't feel qualified. We don't want it to lead to difficult questions and grey areas, and so we don't want to open cans of worms that we wish we hadn't opened. Again, fear of rejection and getting asked questions that I can't answer. Not sure how people will respond, or if it's the right time. Not confident enough. Worried about other questions. Fear of judgment. Having no confidence in knowing what to share. I don't know. Others don't share the same views that will be laughed at, or that will ask questions that we can't prove. We're worried that people will think we're not logical. The risk of causing offense, of saying that Jesus is the only way to God. What about other religions? And still they're coming in. So maybe they don't really believe it. Maybe others won't be interested in what we think. So lots and lots of, and can you see what everyone else has written? Okay, so we can leave those there, and if you think of anything else, you can type it in as we go along. So we're going to go from the questions that I've just been asking back to the book of Philippians, and we'll be coming back to those things which are still coming in as we speak. So the Christians in Philippi, they had heard that Paul was in prison, and they were concerned with this news. Although it's been 10 years since Paul established the church in Philippi, he almost certainly dropped in on them from time to time over that 10 years, because Philippi, as you might better see from this map, is right in the middle of a really important road and a transport route at the time. The Ignatian Way goes from Durrës, which we will hear a bit more about in a few weeks' time, on the left, right the way over to what was Constantinople, and Philippi is right slap bang in the middle. So the chances are that Paul had travelled this route and dropped in on this church a number of times. And so these Christians in Philippi, they knew Paul personally. They'd met him, they knew him, they'd heard he was in prison, and they were concerned about him. But Paul, part of the reason he's writing this letter is he wants to reassure them that yes, he's in prison, but he is okay. In fact, he goes further than that and says that because he's in prison, this has actually helped to advance the spread of the gospel. And Paul wasn't... Paul was quite used to physical hardship. We know when we looked at our series last year that he was put in prison, he got beaten up, he experienced all kinds of hardships and persecutions. Several times he nearly got killed, nearly died, because he was passionate about telling people about Jesus, and sometimes those people didn't want to hear about Jesus, because Paul knew that we are in a spiritual battle. And so that whenever the good news of Jesus comes up against the rulers and against the authorities and against the powers of this dark world and against the spiritual forces of evil, then there's going to be a reaction. So whenever the light starts to shine and push out the darkness, there is going to be a reaction. But we do have promises within God's word that Jesus has overcome the world. Jesus says that the one that's in you is greater than the one who is in the world, and we know that the darkness is never going to be able to overcome the light. But there has been a reaction, and Paul finds himself in prison. But ironically, this has the negative effect to the one that was intended, because now more people are hearing and responding to the gospel because Paul is in prison. And perhaps more strangely, from verse 14, we see that local Christians in Rome have become more confident in God, and they've dared all the more to proclaim the good news without fear because Paul is in prison. And I've been thinking about this week and trying to answer this question. If you're a bunch of people in Rome and you're reluctant to share your faith because of what might happen to you, how does the fact that a prominent local Christian get thrown into prison because of their faith, how is that going to give you more confidence and take away your fear? But this is something that we see going on throughout the world where the church is persecuted. This is one of the podcasts that I listen to each week, and it is really, it does what it says on the tin, basically. It's inspirational. It's inspirational to hear stories of what God is doing in different parts of the world through the lives of ordinary people. And a couple of months ago, I was listening to an interview with a guy called Mervyn Thomas. He is the founder of Christian Solidarity Worldwide. And he was talking about a time that he'd been in Russia. It was around about the time that Gorbachev became president, so quite a long time ago. Russia was still a closed communist country, and he had been given permission from someone in the Politburo to import 1 million New Testaments into Russia, which he then did. And then about a year or so later, this guy from the Politburo was in in the UK, and he sought out and asked to meet with Mervyn Thomas and asked him to import 1 million proper Bibles. So the whole thing, not just the New Testament and the Psalms, but the whole thing. He asked him to import 1 million full Bibles into Russia. And obviously this guy Mervyn said, well, yes, we can do that. But then he asked him, well, you're a communist. Why have you come and found me here in the UK and asked me to import 1 million full Bibles into Russia? And this guy's response was something along the lines of, well, we have been trying to kill the church in Russia for years and years. We've banned the Bible. It's an offense to own a Bible. You can't buy a Bible in church, and yet the church, you can't buy a Bible in the shops, and yet the church keeps on growing. And we find Christians who have scraps of the Bible written on bits of paper, or they have just one page of the Bible that somebody has typed out by hand, or they've memorized verses from the Bible. And yet when I come to the UK or I come to the US, there are so many Bibles. They are everywhere. You find them in your hotel rooms, you can go to the shops and you can buy them, and there's all kinds of translations. The Bible is everywhere, and yet the church is dying. And so this man's strategy to kill the church was to flood Russia with Bibles. And we see in the Bible, and we know from experience, that often the easier life becomes, the more likely we are to take our eyes off Jesus. And so I think these Christians in Rome were motivated and challenged by Paul's example, because for a number of reasons. One, it forced them to rethink some of the things that Jesus had said. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? And Jesus carries on the next line. For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. And so I think they would have been motivated and challenged not just by being reminded of the words of Jesus, but also as they saw how God worked through weakness and suffering. Or maybe you could even go a step further and say that it wasn't that God was able to work through their weakness and their suffering. Maybe it's God was able to work because of their weakness and suffering. This was certainly Paul's experience. He wrote in a different letter, and he says, "This is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." And so Paul had found that when he was kind of at his lowest points, God was able to do most. I mean, we read there in Philippians about the word spreading throughout the whole palace guard. And I expect part of what is going on there is that everyone that was watching, they knew why Paul was there, but they couldn't get their heads round it. You know, all he had to do was say, "Caesar is Lord," and all of his troubles would go away. He was obviously bright, he was obviously extremely intelligent, and yet he persisted and continued with this line that this guy called Jesus had died, that he'd come back to life, and that he was God. And because Paul doesn't seem to be crazy, and because he is prepared to stake his life, pledging his allegiance to Jesus, then I wonder how many of these people that were watching on thought, well, maybe this claim is worth exploring. If this guy is prepared to stake his life on it, maybe there is something in what he is saying. And then I think another reason that the Christians in Rome would have been encouraged and challenged was because they saw that although Paul was in prison, he was content, he was full of joy, and he had a deep and real peace. He was the sort of person that if you were living in Rome and you thought, I know, I'll go and visit Paul. I'll take him some food in prison. I'll go and encourage him a bit today. And yet you'd leave feeling, I've done nothing for Paul. He's done it all for me. I feel so encouraged. I feel so blessed having spent this time with Paul. He was that sort of person. You go to encourage him, but you'd come away much more encouraged. You'd be aware of the peace and the joy that was in his life, even though he was in prison. And the peace and joy that you saw in the life of Paul was all tied up in a lifestyle that made hardship and persecution inevitable. And I'm careful. I'm trying to be careful not to go on and talk about passages that other people are going to be talking about in the coming weeks. But if you've read through Philippians and right the way to the end, you will know that Paul knows he can't lose. Whether he lives or whether he dies, he wins. And so that's where his sense of joy and contentment and peace comes from. Whatever happens, he cannot lose. Today is the final day let me just see if we've got any more comments in here. Is the final day in Mental Health Awareness Week. And we've seen some of those responses that talk about being afraid and being worried about sharing our faith. What might happen? What might people say? How might people react? What might they think? And we live in a world where many people are anxious and worried and fearful. And me asking you to share your faith is the sort of thing that can trigger worry and anxiety and fear in many of us. And there are lots of verses in the Bible that tell us, do not be afraid. But we know from our own personal experience that when we became a Christian, we still have times when we're anxious, we still have times when we're worried, we still have things that we are fearful about. That didn't all stop when I became a Christian. We also know that bravery and courage is about doing something that you are afraid of doing, but doing it in spite of the fear. You do it anyway. And so I think that when we talk about sharing our faith, for many of us, it will make us anxious. It will break out in a cold sweat. Our mouths will go dry and our tongue will stick to the top of our mouth. But we shouldn't let our fear dictate our actions. And this is one of the reasons why we need to be praying for each other. Praying that we will be confident. Praying that we will be able to proclaim the gospel without fear or in spite of our fear. And we should also be looking for opportunities to share our own stories and to encourage each other with our stories. You may have come across this report from the Bible Society. It's called The Quiet Revival. It's not one of quite a few different pieces of research that have come out over the last few weeks and months that show that there is something interesting going on in many parts of the world, including here in the UK. And although it's not exclusively, it is largely, particularly because of what's going on amongst what are known as Gen Z. And for those of you that have no idea who Gen Z are, we're roughly talking about people who are between 13 years old and 28 years old. So that's kind of the age range that we are thinking about. The Baptist Union, for example, this week they reported that baptisms, church attendance, contact with children, and contact with families are all up. That there were 800 more baptisms in 2024 than there were in the previous year. And so every year they write to us, and every other Baptist church, they get statistics. And all those statistics are showing that something is happening. In 2024, all the figures are up from where they were in 2023. Just a few headlines from the Quiet Revival. One of the things that they say in there is that having a Christian faith is again being normalized and is even culturally attractive. So people are much less likely to have a negative response if you say that you are a Christian, particularly amongst that 13 to 28 year old bracket. Church attendance across the board is pretty much up, particularly amongst young men. So if you look at young men, 6 years ago, it was about 4% in that bracket would say they went to church. Now in this research, it's gone up from 4% to 21%. 21% from 4%. Young people are a lot more likely to be spiritual than previous generations. They are a lot more open to faith. Now, that does mean that they are much more open to absolutely everything, but they are also much more open to Christianity. So, for example, 34% of them said that they would attend church if they were invited by a friend. That's over a third. 56% said they would be happy to be prayed for by a friend. That's more than half. And there are various theories, and things are being written and published about what is happening and why is it happening. But I think it's almost certainly got to do with, particularly amongst that younger generation, people searching for purpose and searching for meaning. Now, young people are growing up in a world where their experience has been hugely shaped by COVID. I mean, if you're 13, what percentage of your life was affected and impacted by COVID and lockdown and all of that? They're growing up in a world where they are faced with the climate crisis, and how is that going to impact them when they are older? And how they see that the generations that seem to be responsible for the crisis that they are going to be facing also kind of wash their hands of it and want nothing, and don't seem to be doing anything serious to sort it out. They're also a generation that are entering the job market heavily in debt and with little prospect of ever owning their own home. And for the first time, we have a generation who do not expect to be better off than their parents. And people are looking for a story that will make sense of their experience. They're looking for a story that will provide them with hope and meaning and purpose. And so we're finding that people are reading the Bible for the first time. They're coming to church for the first time, and they're finding a story that is totally compelling when they read about Jesus. And so I'm sharing this with you because I want to encourage you this week that there has never been a better time to be bold and courageous in our faith. You know, we don't need to have all the answers. We just need to share our story. As Peter says in 1 Peter 3, verse 15, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Those of you who had your bulletins this week will have read there about the summer festival. You've heard me talk about this over the last few weeks. The Combaton Festival, 5th of July. And along with St Mary's, we're going to have an opportunity to kind of be a presence as a part of that. And I'd encourage many of you to volunteer and to help out and to be a presence, because as we've seen, there are, what were those percentages? 30-something% of people would attend church if they were invited by a friend. 50-something% would respond positively if somebody offered to pray for them. And we're going to be sharing on that summer festival there as a presence as the village comes together, something of the hope that we have. And there will be people who want to respond to that and who will want to know more about that and will want to know how, even in our struggles and even in our darkest times, how God has been there, how God has given us peace, how we've been able to know joy, how we have meaning and purpose in our lives. So let's be bold and let's be courageous this week as we look to share our faith, offer to pray for somebody. And if your heart starts to beat a little bit too fast, or you go into a cold sweat, then it's probably the Holy Spirit telling you should be doing something. And it's up to you whether you do it or not. But I would encourage you to do not be afraid. They may say no, and they may not be interested, and they may ask you a difficult question. But don't let the prospect of those things stop us from being courageous and taking the opportunity. We just got a whole bunch of these little booklets, The Bridge to Life, this week. They're over in the rack in the centre. If you want to take one of those away, stick it in your pocket. Maybe you want to read it first and kind of so you know what it says. It might give you a few pointers in how to share your faith. But if somebody does ask you, as part of a conversation, what does it mean to be a Christian? Well, just give them one of those, or just go through it with them and pray and see what God will do. Often it's when we're at our weakest that God works, because he's not working in spite of, he's working because of our weaknesses. Let's pray.